Baal. Baal was one of the most prominent false gods condemned throughout the Old Testament. His name means Lord or Master, and he was worshipped by the Canaanites as a storm god who controlled rain, fertility, and agriculture. Often depicted holding a thunderbolt, Baal was seen as a powerful force of nature and a rival to Yahweh in Israelite territory. The worship of Baal included sacrifices and rituals, sometimes even human offerings, which deeply angered the God of Israel. The Bible shows us a dramatic confrontation with Baal worship on Mount Carmel, where Elijah squared off against 450 prophets of Baal in a high-stakes contest to prove who was the true God. Baal worship was dehumanizing, twisting sexuality and killing the innocent, while the Lord gave life and blessing without corruption. Asherah. She was a mother goddess associated with fertility, love, and sacred groves. Sometimes called the Queen of Heaven, she was worshipped in various ancient cultures, including the Canaanites, where she was often paired with Baal or El. Shockingly, archaeological evidence shows that some Israelites attempted to blend worship of Asherah with worship of Yahweh, even setting up Asherah poles in places of worship. The Bible strongly condemns this syncretism. In Deuteronomy 16:21, God explicitly commands, "Do not set up any wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to the Lord your God." The presence of Asherah poles throughout Israel became a sign of spiritual corruption and backsliding. King Josiah famously destroyed them during his religious reforms to restore purity to the temple. Asherah represents more than a mythological goddess. She embodies the dangerous blending of truth and error, where devotion to God is polluted by cultural compromise. Molech. Molech, sometimes spelled Moloch, was perhaps the most disturbing of all false gods mentioned in the Bible. Associated with the Ammonites, Molech demanded child sacrifice, something God absolutely detested. Worshippers would offer their sons as burnt offerings, placing them in the arms of a bronze idol that had been heated until glowing. Leviticus 18:21 warns, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God." Despite this, even King Solomon, in his later years, built a high place for Molech, setting a precedent for future kings to follow. Centuries later, King Josiah destroyed these high places in an effort to purify the land. The worship of Molech is not just about pagan religion. It is portrayed in Scripture as a direct attack on the sanctity of life and the heart of God. Molech represents a distortion so severe that it became a symbol of spiritual rebellion and moral collapse. Dagon. Dagon was a Philistine god of grain and fertility, often depicted with a fish-like body, half man, half fish. He was worshipped in cities like Ashdod and Gaza, and is most famously mentioned in the story of the Ark of the Covenant. In 1 Samuel 5, after the Philistines captured the Ark, they placed it in Dagon's temple as a trophy. But the next morning, they found Dagon's statue face down before the Ark. They set it upright, only to find it the next day broken into pieces, its head and hands removed. This dramatic scene symbolized the utter defeat of Dagon before the presence of the true God. Dagon's presence in the Bible reveals how false gods can appear dominant for a moment, but ultimately collapse in the face of divine power. His fall also mirrors the fate of any idol or belief system that seeks to dethrone God from his rightful place. Chemosh. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites and another deity linked to child sacrifice. His name may mean destroyer or subduer, and his worship was marked by violence, war, and human offering. In 2 Kings 3:27, the Moabite king sacrifices his own son on the city wall as a desperate plea to Chemosh for victory in battle. Solomon, again led astray by foreign wives, built a shrine for Chemosh on a hill east of Jerusalem, a decision that contributed to God's anger and the eventual division of Israel. Chemosh worship reveals the tragic consequences of spiritual compromise and the danger of placing political alliances or romantic interests above devotion to God. Like Molech, Chemosh represents how false gods demand far more than worship. They demand destruction. Their grip is not only spiritual but societal, corrupting entire cultures through fear and bloodshed. Astarte. Astarte, often equated with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, was another major figure in ancient Near Eastern religion. She was a goddess of fertility, war, and love, and her worship included highly sexualized rituals, temple prostitution, and symbolic acts meant to invoke prosperity. In the Bible, Astarte is frequently linked to the corruption of Israel's worship practices. Judges 2:13 says, "They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths." The plural Ashtoreths suggests widespread and diverse forms of her worship across the region. Astarte's appeal was sensual and material, promising power, fertility, and love in exchange for loyalty to her rights. But beneath the surface, her cult promoted spiritual adultery, turning hearts away from the covenant with God. She symbolized indulgence, spiritual compromise, and the confusion of desire with devotion. Her presence in Israel's history shows how quickly sacred spaces can be defiled when culture trumps conviction. Bel. Bel, also known as Marduk, was the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, a god of order, magic, and civilization. He's portrayed as a great warrior who defeated the sea monster Tiamat to bring creation into being. In Jeremiah 52, God declares, "Bel is put to shame, Marduk is filled with terror. Her images are put to shame, her idols are filled with terror." This was a direct warning to Babylon. Their god would fall. Bel represented human civilization's attempt to glorify itself through empire, conquest, and grandeur. Babylon was a society known for its towering ziggurats and its defiance of God. And Bel was at the center of that pride. He wasn't just a false god, he was a symbol of human arrogance, wrapped in ritual and myth. His fall in biblical prophecy foretold the collapse of any kingdom that exalts itself above the knowledge of the one true God. Tammuz. Tammuz was a Sumerian fertility god associated with the seasonal cycle of death and rebirth. His mythology tells of a dying young god mourned by his followers, whose death causes nature to wither, and whose return brings renewal. The Bible references him in Ezekiel 8:14, where the prophet sees women at the temple weeping for Tammuz, a vision that deeply offends God. This practice was a form of emotional, religious idolatry that had seeped into sacred spaces. Tammuz worship often included public rituals of mourning, symbolizing longing for renewal, but in God's eyes, it was spiritual betrayal. Israel had traded true covenant relationship for theatrical sentimentality, crying for a false god while ignoring the living one. Tammuz reminds us that emotional depth or sincerity does not equal truth. Even heartfelt worship, when directed to the wrong source, becomes idolatry. The Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven is mentioned several times in the book of Jeremiah, often in the context of Israel's spiritual adultery. In Jeremiah 44:17, the people defend their idolatry by saying they will continue to offer incense and pour out drink offerings to her, as we and our ancestors did. Scholars believe this figure refers to Astarte or Ishtar under a different name. But more than a single goddess, the Queen of Heaven represented a cultural fixation with divine femininity, prosperity, and ritual. Women baked cakes for her. Families worshipped her together, and she became a household name in the truest sense. But God calls it rebellion. Her worship wasn't neutral. It was personal, defiant, and collective. It was a declaration that the people no longer saw Yahweh as enough. The Queen of Heaven wasn't just a false god, she was a rival for the affections of an entire generation, and that made her especially dangerous. Nebo. Nebo, or Nabu, was the Babylonian god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge, often depicted with a stylus in hand, recording human destiny. He was seen as the divine scribe who determined the fates of kings and nations. In Isaiah 46:1 we read, "Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden." This verse mocks the idea that gods of intellect and destiny could be hauled around on carts. Nebo represents the exaltation of intellect above revelation, the temptation to worship knowledge itself as divine. In many ways, Nebo is the forerunner of modern idolatry, a faith in human reason over divine truth. While the Bible affirms wisdom as a gift, it warns against turning wisdom into a god. Nebo's fall is a reminder that the mind is a tool, not a throne. Remphan. Remphan, sometimes called Remphan or Chiun, depending on the translation, is referenced in Acts 7:43, where Stephen, addressing the Sanhedrin, says, "You took up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god Remphan, the figures you made to worship. This reference traces back to Amos 5:26 and is linked to an astral deity worshipped during Israel's rebellion in the wilderness. While much about Remphan remains mysterious, scholars associate him with Saturn worship, a planetary deity tied to star worship and ancient astrology. The mention of a star hints at Israel's flirtation with celestial cults, borrowing from surrounding cultures to create hybrid spiritual practices. Remphan represents a subtle yet dangerous shift, when God's people replace him with cosmic fascination, seeking power in the stars instead of the Creator. The warning is clear. When we worship creation instead of the Creator, even celestial beauty becomes idolatry. Artemis. Artemis, known to the Romans as Diana, was the goddess of the hunt, fertility, and protection of women. Her temple in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and she was revered with elaborate processions, statues, and chants. In Acts 19, when Paul's preaching threatens the sale of Artemis idols, a riot breaks out as the crowd shouts, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for hours. Artemis was not just a goddess, she was an economy, a cultural identity, and a spiritual stronghold. Her worship shows how idolatry can be deeply embedded in societal norms, even protected by popular opinion and commerce. The resistance Paul faced wasn't just religious, it was economic and political. Artemis reminds us that false gods aren't always hidden behind myths. Sometimes they're guarded by systems, monuments, and mobs. Zeus. Zeus, the king of the Greek pantheon, was the god of sky and thunder, known for his power and unpredictability. In Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas heal a man, and the people of Lystra proclaim that the gods have come down to us in human form. They call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, and attempt to offer sacrifices to them. Paul immediately tears his clothes in grief, pleading with the people to turn away from such idolatry. Zeus represents the tendency to project divinity onto charismatic figures, to confuse miraculous power with divine identity. In the ancient world, Zeus was the ultimate projection of human strength, authority, and indulgence. His worship highlights how even noble qualities like leadership and protection can become idols when elevated above God. Zeus reminds us that idol worship doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like admiration gone too far. Tammuz. Though Tammuz was already discussed earlier, it's worth noting how his Babylonian form, Tammuz, appears in deeper layers of syncretism. His myths centered on seasonal death and resurrection, and his followers participated in ritual mourning to invoke his return. These public displays of lament were common in temple spaces, often led by women. In Ezekiel 8:14, God shows the prophet a vision of women weeping for Tammuz at the entrance of the temple, an act that evokes divine disgust. While it may appear sentimental, it was a direct violation of the temple's holiness. The worship of Tammuz was more than pagan ritual. It was an emotional hijack of sacred space. When longing and grief are directed toward the wrong source, even our sincerest feelings become misaligned. Tammuz represents spiritual misdirection disguised as heartfelt devotion. The beast and the image. While not a mythological god in the traditional sense, the beast and the image described in Revelation 13 function as false gods in the end times. The beast receives power from the dragon, Satan, performs great signs, and demands global worship. The second beast, the false prophet, sets up an image of the first beast and commands that all must worship it, or die. This marks a return to the kind of idol worship seen in Daniel's time, but on a global, supernatural scale. The worship of the beast is enforced by economic control, social pressure, and deception through signs and wonders. What makes this particularly insidious is the merging of political power, spiritual allegiance, and public spectacle, a triad of manipulation that mimics divine authority. The beast is the ultimate counterfeit deity, standing as the final and most dangerous false god before Christ's return. His rise serves as the final warning that true worship must remain unmoved, even in the face of death.